Well, let's bring Lawrence Korb in. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the U.S. He's in Washington, D.C. Lawrence, good to have you with us. So, of course, Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, met with the Saudi King and Crown Prince yesterday. They have denied all knowledge of what happened to Khashoggi. President Trump seems very willing to accept that at face value. What do you make of all this?
Well, Trump is acting actually against U.S. and world interests. For example, he said, you're innocent till proven guilty. No, the burden of proof is on the Saudis. The journalist Khashoggi walked in there. They haven't accounted for him. He's also said, well, we still need to sell them the arms. No, he should have used that as a bargaining position and say, unless you come forward, hold the people responsible, we're not going to continue to sell you arms. And the meeting between Secretary of State Pompeo and MBS yesterday looked like a love fest. They were laughing and joking. This is a very, very serious matter.
Yeah, and wanting to believe that the Saudi leadership wasn't implicated is one thing. Actively trying to find an explanation that doesn't implicate them is another. And President Trump is being accused of moral apathy in the U.S. I mean, how damaging is this for him?
Well, this is not going over well. Even his own supporters, like Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, is outraged here at what happened. And what is important to keep in mind, the Congress really has control over the arms sales. And it's going to be very hard for me to think that they will approve these deals that Trump has made, which, by the way, he's exaggerated. But nonetheless, we do sell a significant amount of arms to Saudi Arabia.
And it's interesting, though, isn't it, that the U.S., and many other countries have turned a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's the allegations of a lack of empathy with human rights, locking up activists, sentencing prisoners to death, the involvement in Yemen, which is a massive humanitarian catastrophe. The disappearance of this man seems to have precipitated the crisis. Why is that?
Well, I think because he is a resident in the United States. He's not an American citizen, but he has applied for the citizenship. And the other is he's a journalist who writes for one of our leading newspapers. So everybody knows who he is. And it's not just a question of, the Saudis doing these horrible things, which they've been doing all along, but it's the whole attack on journalists around the world. And I think that has really crystallized the story. This is much more significant than the poor woman who was arrested for driving into Saudi Arabia, or some of the other things that the MBS has done, locking up all the people in the Ritz-Carlton, cutting off aid to Canada. No, this really hits home here in the United States.
So could we see this as Mohammed bin Salman's big mistake? This is where he's overreached himself, and now the tide will begin to turn.
Well, I hope so. There's no doubt he has overreached himself, but up to now, it hasn't become this well known in the United States. And the other thing about MBS, he was, unlike a lot of the Saudi leaders who I've dealt with over the years, he was not educated outside Saudi Arabia. I don't think he realized that doing this would cause these particular problems. And in fact, Senator Graham, as I mentioned, who's one of President Trump's big supporters, said MBS ought to be moved out of the line of succession and his job taken away.
So in this particular case, the disappearance of Khashoggi, there have been reports in the New York Times that 4 of the men identified by Turkish media who were said to be part of the 15-man alleged hit squad that came in from Saudi, 4 of those men were members of Mohammed bin Salman's personal security detail. Given the sort of evidence and information which is gradually emerging, do you think the Saudi leadership will be able to say with any degree of credibility that they did not have anything to do with the disappearance of Khashoggi?
Well, I think the king, if he wanted to, could say he didn't have anything to do with it. The crown prince did, and that's why I'm going to relieve him. There's no doubt that he was involved. I mean, nothing happens inside or outside Saudi Arabia without him being involved. And the fact that, you know, these people were part of his security detail, you know, it demonstrates that he actually, you know, ordered this to happen. Now, we don't know whether he wanted them killed or, you know, brought back to Saudi Arabia or exactly what. But the fact of the matter is, no, these are his people. And, you know, they flew there to do something. You know, when Mr. Khashoggi came into the embassy, which they know he was going to do, so he could get his marriage license to get married in Turkey.
So do you think that there could be a push to try and remove Mohammed bin Salman? Would it go that far?
I hope so. Now, again, it's very, very hard because, remember, he was not originally the heir apparent, and then he forced somebody else out to, you know, to take over. I think that the Saudis basically are going to recognize, you know, what this has done, and it's going to undermine a lot of their other efforts. You know, for example, in Yemen, as you pointed out, there's a big outcry in the United States already about what's you know, what's happening in Yemen. So I think that you know, this would be one way for the king to calm this down and say, I'm holding the crown prince responsible, I'm moving him from power, and I'm going to designate, you know, whoever, you know, to take over.
Really interesting analysis there, Lawrence. Good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Lawrence Korb there live from Washington, D.C.
Thank you for having me.